Okay,
Thank
thank you,
you.
Camden.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another day of potential snow. Figuring out where all my baseball gear is that needs to be ready for snow tomorrow. Maybe some rain. We'll see how things go. Thanks for joining us all today. We've got a few things to cover on the agenda today. We'll go briefly over the monitoring report, even faster through 2.5.7. And then we have Margie on from our business services department, and Bobby's on as well to support in her presentations. And then we'll switch back to working on the monitoring report. As you know, every quarter we're giving to the board a monitoring report. So this monitoring report was provided to the board on February 26th, 2025, and we just want to walk you through that over the next little bit of time. And I always have to remember how to get rid of hide those pop-ups so they're not in my way. There's different parts of the monitoring report that also fall into play, and one of those is that we also provide the financial statements. We do financial statements as required by statutorily required on a quarterly basis to be presented to the board, and then give an overall presentation as well. And in that presentation, and we've essentially kind of narrowed down the scope of the presentation over time in explaining where we are on the internal monitoring report and looking at the items of 2.4. You know that many of the things that we look at as part of FAC is related to policy 2.4 in its totality. However, not all of 2.4 necessarily is underneath FAC or is necessarily required to be. And then FAC looks beyond not just 2.4, but other pieces. But this particular one is about the district's requirement, the superintendent's requirement to provide an internal monitoring report 2.4 to the board on a quarterly basis. That coincides with providing financial statements as well. The first piece that we talk about, and I have a different slide on this that we covered earlier in the school year, about overall fund balances, the ones that are required by Tabor or the Constitution, the multi-year obligations. Then we have items that are required through contract. So the bond redemption fund through contract with our bondholders. And then our food service nutrition fund is restricted based on federal regulations. After that, we have a group of items that do then get assigned for a very specific purpose. And it can also be dependent upon the specific source of revenue that is used. So for example, those base monies are held within a base fund. All of the tuition that is generated from base stays within base and is spent on base. Same thing with pupil activities, athletics, and the like. We also do set up assignments, for example, on risk. And we've talked about risk, IT, and instructional materials as those key essential items that we want to make sure we are properly reserved for in the event that something happens. So if we do a large instructional adoption, we want to make sure that we have those funds already set aside years in advance because we know ahead of time what we want that schedule or that instructional adoption schedule to be. That way, when we get to the point when we're doing the adoption, we don't then have to reduce expenditures somewhere else in order to pay for that adoption. And the definition of unassigned is anything that isn't restricted or assigned. So if it isn't that, then it's unassigned. The district does have a limit in 2.4 that limits the unassigned fund balance to no less than 4% and no more than 8% of general fund revenues. And we tend to use the same terminology, fiscal year spending, that is used in the Constitution as part of the 3% Tabor calculation. So we show that we're in compliance with that piece, that we show that our minimum fund balance percentage is met, the 4% is met, and we haven't been over that. We do show the overall trend. Again, this is through December 31st. We also look at monitoring our cash position and liquidity. And this year has been a very good year for liquidity overall because of an adjustment made to statute that we've talked about in how we receive our state share payments. So we're really good on where we feel we're decent on cash liquidity. We used to see a fairly steep decline until property tax payments were being received, but that is really no longer the case, which allows us to have that investment policy, comply with the investment policy to seek maturities that are a little bit further out on the 3 to 5 year time frame, which then allows us to potentially generate more investment earnings. Here, again, we're in compliance with the restriction that we do have significant enough funds then to cover the average monthly operating expenses as required under the policy. We've had presentations already this year with FAC on accounts payable and receivables, but this is mostly the receivables, and I think we talked. I'm not going to put words in your mouth, but let's just say it was last time, because I can't remember last time it was, but we talked 1 or 2 meetings ago about receivables, and Kelly had a really good question. Yeah, what generates those receivables and where we have those around. Again, it's mostly in pupil activity. It's in those student fee accounts, and very little now in nutrition because of free meals, and very little in base because we charge in advance. Generally, we're charging in advance prior to kiddos being in the base program. So the bonds and the borrowing, and we'll come back the next meeting. We'll specifically talk about COP, or not COP, MLO, sorry. We'll specifically talk about MLO and MLO tracking and ensuring that what the district is spending funds on has been what's allowed. And this is again through December 31st. And we had not issued bonds out of the 2024 election at that point in time. You've seen and heard already audit compliance and internal controls, and that is the external independent audit, which we're doing really well there. And in fact, I'm meeting with our auditor in a week or so to kick off the 24-25 audit. So I just did a little happy dance there because I'm really excited about getting started on another audit. And again, here is just what we then do and what we're required to do as it relates to the quarterly financial statements. We must compare to the same time period in the prior year. So year to date this year versus the same year to date in the prior year. compare it against actual, and then present an end of year forecast. And that is exactly what we do. Unless you really love reading financial statements, then what you'll see, we have those financial statements and we provide those to the board, generally saying we are on track in providing any foresight into what may be causing any potential variances. And remember, variances are positive or negative. And here, I think our biggest potential for a variance is on the net investment of earnings. You will see that as of December 31st, our budget for net investment of earnings was $4.8 million. And year to date, we had already received $4.6 million. So very obviously, we'll be over our investment budget, which is a good thing because we're talking about revenue. All the other pieces I still believe to be really in line. The issue with other is it's other, and we don't know. No one can budget other because it's other. And in fact, we have an account that's called other miscellaneous other or something like that. So it's difficult to know what it would be, but we do look at overall trends and to adjust those numbers. On the salaries and expense side, probably a little over budgeted. So we'll be under budget on benefits by just a little bit as we get through the end of the year. And that is the mix of people who are taking health insurance benefits as well as the effective rate of para benefits that are paid. And then we go through this with every single fund. Of course, the emphasis is on the general fund because that is the $600 million fund. And I think one of the things that gets lost is that we do and we will start spending quite a bit of time on how we spend $830 million in a bond project. Notice that we spend $830 million on a bond project over the life of the bonds, somewhere in the neighborhood of 8 years. Notice here, we're spending $600 million every single year. So I know that the emphasis gets put on the bond, but we're actually managing that much of expense, and we're tracking that much expense every single year. So by adding the bonds, we're essentially again, we're not adding to the fact that we're already tracking almost $1 billion of expenses overall on an annual basis. So we do the same thing then on sort of sub-funds of the general fund, which include our instruction reserve. These are the monies that we set aside for curriculum adoption, our IT pieces for device implementation or device making sure device refresh, sorry. And then our risk fund here, where you can see we try to end, or we will end, with a fund balance in our risk fund, which is an assigned fund balance of $5 million, which we feel fairly represents the potential for guarding against any unknown risk. We do the same pieces then on the bond redemption fund, which has the principal and interest payments on the bond, as well as then the building fund, which will then become, as you see out to the forecasted side, as we start looking at the actual first tranche that was issued in January, the first issuance or the series 2025 bonds that netted $185 million. Capital projects, that's where Marty and Bobby will speak about a little bit today. And then the rest of them, and I won't go through each of the individual ones, but these are then grants, base, nutrition, and the like. And those will get presented again on a quarterly basis to the board, as well as essentially everything that we talk about over the life of the school year, where we ensure and put in writing that the superintendent is in compliance with all of the policy pieces. And we covered all of these on the PowerPoint presentation, but this just shows in 14 pages more of the detail that we had shown in each of the individual pieces. And we go over this at a high level, one, to make sure that we're showing you that we're in compliance with the fact that we do need to provide these to the board on a quarterly basis. But what you'll note is that, again, this particular one, proceeds of the bond being spent on allowable items, that is the presentation that we will start receiving in upcoming months. And so you see, again, as I mentioned at the outset, that you see the majority of these policies in our work throughout the year. So I'm going to pause there and see if we have any questions on the superintendent's responsibility to present financial statements, and all of these on a different piece of paper. Then all of these are available and posted on board docs, which I had open and now I don't know what I did with it. But we know that it was on board docs, and we know that it was the late February presentation. February 26th was when it was on the board agenda, which is this monitoring report right here, letter D, monitoring reports. So this was provided to the board on February 26th. So now we want to move to really a much easier one, and I'm not sure, need to do these in different order. I know Gina is still on, so what we want to do now is we're going to move into we don't really, we're just going to lay this out here, and this is a policy 2.5.7. And 2.5.7, if we take a look at 2.5.7, what you'll see here is that, and hopefully that's readable.
Yes, it is, Aaron.
So this says that we shall not, or the superintendent shall not fail to provide, or we will provide, periodic procurement reports to the board. The level of detail and the frequency of those reports will be established by feedback from the board and is intended to be flexible. So this report gets to be very easy to you because we have received no requests for feedback from the board, and we have received no requests for procurement reports from the board. Therefore, we're in compliance with 2.5.7. While we didn't provide anything, we weren't asked to provide anything. So that's hard to say. I don't know how to say it. Part of one of the questions that was asked, and we'll get into this a little bit later in our working session, is we know that the board hasn't asked for this information, and so we know that we're in compliance. So once we get into working session, we'll have a few more things to add there. Any questions on 2.5.7? It's an easy way to make up speed when it's that easy to report. So now we head back to our overall agenda for today's meeting, and where we are right now is we'll head to the deferred maintenance and funds with Margie and Bobby, and the maintenance of plant facilities with Margie as well. So thanks, Margie, for joining us a little bit earlier. I'm going to stop sharing, which will allow you then to drive your presentation. Happy to bring it up if you want me to, but if you could share, it might be easier for you to drive.
All right. Thank you, Aaron. Good morning, everyone. My name is Margie Ammon, and I'm our Director of Facilities Design. And Bobby, if you want to introduce yourself.
Sure. Bobby, I support the budget, and then through business services, support Margie and her team.
All right. Thanks, Bobby. I'm going to bring up my presentation here. So bear with me for a minute to make sure I get the right thing going. Okay, let me get to presentation mode here. All right. I think I need to go up a few. Okay, does everybody see the cover sheet? Just want to make sure. Okay, yes. Awesome. So Bobby and I are reporting on 2.5.2 and 2.5.3, which Aaron's already gone over. The monitoring period we are looking at is July 1st, 2023 through June 30th of 2024. And Molly Brandt, our COO, has presented our monitoring report in January. So Bobby and I are going to present those pieces to you just so that you're familiar with my role a little bit. I co-lead our construction and facilities design team with the director of construction. My role is the director of facilities design. And part of my role is that we manage all of our data for life cycle assessments for our buildings. And we manage the database that holds all of that data. So every one of our facilities is in that database, and it helps us to calculate and estimate big picture what is the replacement value of our facilities and what is the deferred maintenance, or it could also be referred to as renewal and or replacement costs. That's what we referred to deferred maintenance as in the bond. We called it, or in the blueprint planning process, we called it renewal and replacement costs. So I will try to not mix those terms up today. It's easy to mix them up because they all mean the same thing. But with that, I'll get started. The 2.5.2 statement in italics says that our projected cost of deferred maintenance shall not exceed the 10% of the total value of the district facilities replacement cost. I believe this is the second year in a row. It could be the third. I don't recall that we are not in compliance. We are currently at 14.34% over the total value of the district's facilities replacement cost. The goal hopefully is that with our new bond, about $248 million of that bond is to replace deferred maintenance items. So we anticipate that things will look better in the future. What's hard to put in perspective is, even though we're taking care of as many of those items as possible, there are new things that become deferred because their life cycle ends. So it's kind of a balance, but we do believe that by the end of this bond, we hope to be back in compliance, but definitely not a guarantee. So just a quick overview, currently our total replacement cost of our facilities is about $1.3 billion. And we, at the reporting time, our deferred maintenance or renewal costs, whatever you would like to refer to it as, we were at 190 million, just a little bit over 190 million. And that's what got us to that 14%. And there are different factors that bring us the increases. We increased by 20 million this fiscal year in our deferred maintenance. It's inflation of construction and materials and equipment. It is also due to, like I just mentioned, that parts and equipment and components of buildings exceed their life, so then they become part of the renewal costs. And then also just the costs for materials themselves. I think I did kind of mention that, but besides escalation of construction itself and labor, we also have equipment that becomes more and more expensive. So those are really the main reasons why we feel that it increased by 20 million this past year. I did want to let you know briefly so that you're prepared next year that we just finished a transition to a new software. So all of the data I'm telling you about right now comes from CostLab. That was our software that we had been using for about 16 years since I came here 17 years ago. We chose to transition a couple years ago. It was a pretty massive transition. If you can imagine, we have over 60 buildings and we had to take all of that data and transition it to a new system that looks at data a little bit differently. And so when we report next year, it is, I want to say likely, and I also want to say for sure, that our deferred maintenance will increase at a noticeable cost. It will have a quite noticeable increase. However, so will our replacement value. So hopefully we'll be still in the range of the 14% over, but I do caution that we could reach a higher level of not being in compliance because we're looking at our buildings differently in this new system. And as we continue to dial it in, and I'm sure Aaron could speak to this too, bringing on new softwares, they aren't perfect for the first year you use them. You're dialing them in. The team's getting used to using the data. We're reviewing the data with other stakeholders and massaging it. So our hope is that as we get this software more up to speed, we feel it's pretty good right now, that we'll get our arms wrapped around it, and by the end of the bond, things are going to look pretty good. But we are tracking data a little bit differently. CostLab didn't allow us to track all data. So now we're tracking more data in the system, which definitely makes our replacement value and deferred maintenance go up. So just be prepared next year for those changes. Michael, looks like you have a question.
Yeah, just to understand that. So is it that it's using different assumptions about useful lives or cost estimates, or because I think what I heard you say is we're capturing more data. Does that mean that there are assets that are not being captured today that will be captured in the future, and that's why the costs go up? Why does the percentage change?
Yes, so there were items that we weren't tracking because CostLab didn't have them. And we would have had to do a lot of customization, and we just weren't able to do that. So I can tell you a few things that, just a few examples of items that are now in our new system. Our new system, by the way, is called VFA. It's VFA Facility. We don't know what that acronym stands for. We've asked them. I don't even know if they know, but it's a product that is owned by Gordian, a management software by Gordian. They are a pretty massive company. They also are an industry known company because they also own RS Means, which is a nationwide cost estimating system that is used by contractors, by organizations, by large property development companies to estimate costs for buildings. So this database, so they own that that data and update it annually, and it is part of this database. The cost lab did not have ours, means they had their own database of construction costs and material costs. So we feel that's going to be more accurate. And what that allows them to do is provide more options for items we can include. So some items that are trackable now that were not in Cost Lab are landscape elements, such as grass areas, irrigation, playgrounds, scoreboards, dugouts, storage buildings. So these are just a few of the items that we didn't have in Cost Lab. Another large difference is in Cost Lab, everything was in by components. So rooftop units were their own individual components. We even had light switches and outlets as individual components, and they were estimated per building, right? We've chosen to go with more of a system-based approach. So instead of having separate outlets and parts and pieces of electrical systems, which we didn't have them all in, we'll have an electrical system for a building that includes all of those items as RS means items. So they've created those systems for us, VFA has. And they cover more elements and more, which then creates a higher replacement value and a higher deferred maintenance if it's out of its life cycle.
Okay, so let me rephrase my question and make sure that I'm clear about this. So the way I read this policy statement, and Aaron, please weigh in, it makes no mention of how we track the items, right? So my worry in what you said is if there's a difference in the assumptions around useful lives or the different assumptions around replacement cost, and that's what changes the total value of the facilities, or it changes the value of the maintenance, deferred maintenance, that I understand. If there's new stuff that we're capturing that's not in the system now, do we have to account for the stuff that's not in the system now? Because as you mentioned, dugouts and scoreboards and landscape and irrigation, that sounds like it might be fairly sizable in dollar amount. Is that a concern for us that we have to account for in the report today?
It's in the system now for next fiscal year, but it wasn't prior.
I guess what I'm saying is for the current fiscal year, the one that we're reviewing and reporting on now.
Okay, go ahead, Aaron.
And I think we'll talk about that, Michael, in the follow-up at the end, but no. So we're looking currently just at the current definition or the current way it was replaced. And then I think as we look towards suggestions for next year, we'll put this as an asterisk of things that we'll be on the lookout for next year as we understand the definition of deferred maintenance and what's the definition of, or what's in the total of those assets and facilities that are being tracked.
Okay, I think as a follow-up, I think it'd be helpful for me just to understand, just Margie, to your point, like to understand if those are now in the system, what are the items and how much do they add up to? I'm just curious, we don't have to do it now on the call, but maybe as a follow-up to understand, just sizing it to bigger than a bread box type thing. I'd just be curious to know what the scope is of the stuff that's not in the system today. I mean, if it's de minimis and, immaterial, that's fine. But the list of stuff sounded like it might be something to think about.
Yeah, I think we could come up with a list for the future, and I'll let Aaron and Gina tell us when we should do that. And also, I just want to mention too, Michael, that what I tried to explain is in this year's 2.5.2. We didn't want to put all that on these slide presentations, but I believe you guys do have the full monitoring report. So feel free to also refer back to that to read it again, and maybe it'll make more sense. But I do believe next year when we report, if we could probably answer those questions, or Aaron, and if we want to come up with a list sooner than later to report to this team, I'm happy to work with you all to do that.
Great, thank you.
Okay, if there aren't any other questions, I'll go to the next slide for Bobby.
Sure. Thanks, Margie. So kind of the other part of this one is essentially almost like a cap on it. So the verbiage is on there, basically a maximum 3% that we hold, within replacements. Within the capital reserve, we have earmarked within there, within a certain project, plant basically contingencies. With that, it's, as Margie said, our denominator basically is 1.3 billion, correct, Margie, for our replacement costs. So hitting 3% over of that is a lofty achievement on that. So as you can see kind of in the little subtext there, that out of the 3%, we're at 0.003. So we're well within, under that cap. One thing to note is that we did use 1.4 million of that one for part of North Stadium, approved by BOE, within, that period. So kind of again, I think, and Aaron, if you want to have color commentary on it, the way I always understand this one is that this is basically to keep districts from keeping a huge amount of fund balance, in that they're, constant recycling these funds, and it's not just sitting there. And it's a reasonable amount that we're, kind of putting away in contingency for plant replacement. So I think that's about it on that one. Margie, do you want to?
All right, thanks, Bobby. Any questions for Bobby then? Let me go to the next slide here. All right, so the next one is that we shall not fail to maintain the facility to be open 99% of available instructional hours. And during the fiscal year that we're reporting, we were out of compliance for one of our buildings, and it was on Martin Luther King Day when we had the freeze issue. Not this year. It happened to come this year too, but the previous year. And some water lines broke and flooded parts of Centennial Elementary School. And it did have to be closed for some time. So it was operational for less than what it should have been. But I believe they made it up somehow. I don't know those logistics. But since then, we put in protocols to avoid that, and those were used this fiscal year, and it was very successful, and we didn't have the same issues. So we just wanted to report on that piece, and that is also in the the full monitoring report. Any questions about that?
Margie, while you put in these mitigations at Centennial Elementary School, were any other schools considered, realizing that they didn't have the same type of pipe breaking and flooding issue, but just curious if that is something that should be considered to be expanded to other schools, or any thoughts on that?
Yeah, great question, Kelly. So the protocols that were put in place were district-wide. It included custodial teams going and checking on items. We changed, I believe, some set points on HVAC equipment. There were other protocols that were put in place, but it was a district-wide plan that involved all of our buildings so that we wouldn't have breaks somewhere else. So yes, it did address everywhere.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you, dear.
Yeah, you're welcome. I believe that is our full report. So any questions? If not, I'll stop sharing.
Great. Thank you, Margie. I appreciate it. Always glad when the team can hear from more folks. So appreciate Margie and Bobby for hopping on today.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You don't need us to stay, right, Aaron? Or would you like us to stay?
No need.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks, you
Thank
too,
you.
Margie and
Bye-bye.
Bobby.
And Camden, that ends the meeting, and we'll go now into our work session.